Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The morning of February 24th, 2023 began the way most Friday mornings did in Herndon, Virginia. Quietly, in a neighborhood where lawnmowers hummed on weekends and school buses stopped at the end of manicured driveways. The streets were calm, the houses were large, and behind the walls of one such house, a woman named Christine Banfield was preparing, unknowingly, to spend the last hours of her life. Christine was 37 years old, and by every measure that neighbors, colleagues, and patients could offer, she was extraordinary. She worked as a pediatric intensive care nurse, one of the most emotionally and physically demanding roles in all of medicine, and she was known among those who worked alongside her for her warmth and her unwillingness to give up on a child, no matter how dire the circumstances. Before that, she had served as a sexual assault nurse examiner, sitting beside survivors in their darkest hours, bearing witness to pain so that the justice system could act. It was work that asked a person to be both strong and tender at the same time, and Christine did it without complaint. She carried her patients home in her heart. At home in Herndon, Christine had built what looked like a full and happy life. She had a husband, Preston Banfield, a 40-year-old agent with the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigations Division, a trained federal investigator whose job it was to follow money trails and expose fraud. They had a little girl together, a 4-year-old named Valeria, who was the bright center of their household. On that February morning, Valeria was downstairs, waiting to go to the zoo. Her mother was upstairs, and something irreversible was already in motion. In October 2021, she and Brendan made a decision that seemed, at the time, entirely ordinary. Their daughter was young, their schedules were demanding, and they needed help. So they hired an au pair, a live-in childcare provider, to assist with Valeria's care. The young woman they brought into their home was Juliana Perez Magalhães, a Brazilian woman in her early 20s who had come to the United States seeking a new life. She moved into the Banfield house, helped with the child, shared meals in their kitchen, and became, by necessity, a part of the family's daily rhythms. For nearly a year, the arrangement seemed to work. Then in August 2022, something shifted. Preston Banfield and Juliana Perez Magalhães began a romantic affair, intimate, secretive, and increasingly consuming. They took a trip to New York City together. The walls of the family home, which had once held Christine and Brendan's shared life, now held a different kind of secret. Brendan confided in Juliana about his marriage. He told her that divorce was not an option, not because he loved his wife, but because of money, because of custody, because of the financial consequences that ending a marriage legally would bring. During these conversations that Brendan decided something darker. He had expressed, she said, a desire to end his marriage without going through a divorce at all. The affair was no longer just a betrayal. It was becoming something else entirely. What Preston Banfield allegedly did next was, in its cold engineering, almost incomprehensible. He was a federal investigator. He understood how evidence worked, how crime scenes told stories, and how investigators pieced together what had happened after the fact. And so, when he began to construct a plan, he did not do so carelessly. He built it like a case file, methodically, with a theory, a cover story, and a fall guy. The internet gave him the tool he needed. FetLife is a social platform designed for adults interested in fantasy roleplay. It is a world of usernames and pseudonyms, of private messages and negotiated encounters. Preston Banfield created a fake FetLife account using Christine's own email address and her personal laptop. He gave the account Christine's identity and began posing as her, communicating with strangers, building digital relationships in her name, without her knowledge. Among the men whose profiles caught his attention was a man named Joseph Ryan. Joseph was 39 years old, a man from Washington, D.C. with no connection whatsoever to the Banfields. No shared history, no mutual friends, no reason to have ever crossed paths with the suburban Virginia family. He was just a man living his life, until a message arrived from a profile he believed belonged to a woman named Christine. That message laid out a fantasy, an encounter involving a knife, a scenario steeped in roleplay, framed as consensual and planned. His username on the platform, a casual, even playful combination of words, gave no indication that he had any idea he was walking into something real and deadly. Over the weeks that followed, messages passed back and forth between Joseph and the account Brendan controlled. Directions were given. A time was arranged. An address was provided. Joseph Ryan was told exactly how to arrive, how to enter, what to expect. He was told he was coming to meet Christine. He was told she wanted this. He believed every word. February 24th, 2023 was Brendan Banfield's birthday. That detail sits at the center of this case like a stone in cold water, still heavy, impossible to look away from. On the morning of the day he turned 41 years old, Brendan Banfield's plan was ready. Police received 911 calls from the Banfield residence that morning. The caller was frantic, the story sudden and brutal. An intruder had broken in, attacked Christine, and had been shot in self-defense. Officers from the Fairfax County Police Department arrived to a scene that seemed, on its surface, to confirm that account. In an upstairs bedroom, they found Christine Banfield. She had been stabbed multiple times, including in the neck. She was alive when officers arrived, but grievously wounded. Beside her lay Joseph Ryan, a man no one at the scene recognized, shot multiple times by 2 different guns. He was dead. Brendan Banfield was at the scene. Juliana Perez Magalhaes was at the scene. And downstairs, unharmed and waiting, was 4-year-old Valeria. The story Brendan and Juliana told investigators was seamless in its outline. Ryan had come into the house, had attacked Christine, and they had fired their weapons to stop him. It was self-defense. It was heroism. The intruder lay dead, and the family had survived. Christine Banfield did not survive. She died at the hospital shortly after officers found her. Brendan was taken to the hospital in the aftermath of the chaos. Body camera footage captured the moment he was told that his wife had died. He asked to pray. For 570 days, that story held. Investigators worked the scene. They photographed it, cataloged it, tested it, and slowly, quietly, the physical world began to talk back. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere on the house. A stranger who had broken in to commit a violent assault would have left some mark on the doors, the windows, the locks. There was nothing. The narrative of a home invasion was not supported by the house itself. Then there was the blood. Prosecutors would later argue in court that Christine's blood had been deliberately transferred onto Joseph Ryan's body in an effort to deepen the story, to create the appearance that he had been the attacker, that he had gotten close to her before being stopped. It was a detail that spoke not to panic, but to planning. Panicked people do not stage evidence. Investigators do. The digital trail was where the case began to open. Law enforcement examined devices, computers, phones, accounts, connected to the Banfields and to Joseph Ryan. They found the FetLife profile. They found the messages. They traced the account back to Christine's laptop and her email address, used not by Christine, but by someone else. Ryan had been communicating with a ghost, a constructed identity designed to bring him to that address on that morning. The prosecutors called it catfishing, creating a false online persona to deceive and manipulate a real person into a real situation with real and deadly consequences. On the nightstand in the bedroom, investigators found a framed photograph. It was not a photo of Brendan and Christine. It was a photo of Brendan and Juliana. In October 2023, 8 months after the murders, Juliana Perez Magalhaes was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and firearm offenses. She maintained, at first, that she had acted in self-defense, that Ryan had been a real intruder, that the shooting had been necessary. But the weight of the evidence and the reality of facing decades in an American prison eventually shifted her position. By October 2024, more than a year after her arrest, Juliana accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter in the killing of Joseph Ryan. And in exchange for a reduced sentence, she agreed to do something that would define the final chapter of the case. She agreed to testify against Preston Banfield, the man she had once loved, the man who had told her that divorce was not an option, the man whose plan had brought Joseph Ryan to his death and Christine Banfield to hers. In September 2024, Preston Banfield was indicted on multiple counts of aggravated murder, child endangerment, and firearm charges. Investigators and prosecutors had concluded what the physical and digital evidence had been quietly insisting for months. The home invasion had never happened. There had been no intruder. There had only been a husband, an au pair, a plan, and two people who had no idea they were being used as pieces in someone else's design. Preston Banfield was taken into custody and denied bond, the judge ruling him a flight risk and a danger to his young daughter. The trial of Preston Banfield began in January 2026, 3 years after the mourning Valeria had waited in the basement to go to the zoo. It was a trial that the country had been following for months, a case so strange in its construction, so cold in its execution, so heartbreaking in its victims. The courtroom in Fairfax County filled with the weight of what had happened. Prosecutors laid out their theory with precision, that Preston Banfield had been unwilling to face the financial and personal consequences of a divorce, that he had calculated a murder to be cheaper and simpler than a legal separation, and that he had used his knowledge as a federal investigator to construct a scene that might hold. The defense pushed back. Preston Banfield took the stand in his own defense, a rare decision for any defendant, and a particularly consequential one given how much his own testimony would have to explain away. He acknowledged the affair with Juliana. He acknowledged that he had been unfaithful to Christine in other ways as well. But he denied the plan. He said there was no scheme, that the story prosecutors had built was a theory in search of facts, that Juliana had changed her story only because doing so was the price of her own freedom. He said, publicly and on the record, that he had loved his wife. The jury listened to all of it, to Juliana's testimony, to the digital forensics, to the physical evidence from the bedroom, to the absence of forced entry, to the transferred blood, to the photograph on the nightstand. They listened to the story of Joseph Ryan, a man who had received messages he believed were from a willing partner and had arrived at an address he trusted, never knowing that the woman whose name he had been given was not sending those messages, and that her husband was waiting for him with a gun. The jury deliberated. On February 2nd, 2026, they returned their verdict, guilty on all counts. Guilty of aggravated murder in the killing of his wife. Guilty of aggravated murder in the killing of Joseph Ryan. Guilty of child endangerment for having carried out this plan in the home where his 4-year-old daughter was present. Guilty on firearm charges. The courtroom absorbed the verdict in the way that courtrooms do, with exhales and tears, with grief that had been waiting for a place to land, with the particular, exhausted relief of a legal process that had finally reached its conclusion. Juliana Perez Magalhães was sentenced in the week that followed the verdict. The prosecution, honoring its plea agreement, recommended that she receive credit for time already served in custody and be deported to Brazil. The judge disagreed. The judge sentenced her to 10 years in prison, the maximum sentence available under the terms of her plea, rejecting the recommendation that she be released immediately. The judge's decision reflected what many had come to feel about Juliana's role in the plan, that she had been a participant, not merely a bystander, and that her cooperation with the prosecution, while valuable, did not erase what she had done. In June 2026, Preston Banfield was brought before the court for his own sentencing. He stood before the judge as a man convicted on all counts, facing the mandatory penalties that the law required. He was sentenced to consecutive life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never leave prison. The judge made that clear. The system had made it permanent. In the days surrounding the sentencing, Brendan Banfield reportedly continued to maintain that he had not killed his wife, that he had loved her, that the jury had been wrong. Those words, offered from behind the glass of a courtroom, landed in a world where Christine Banfield's daughter was growing up without her mother, where Joseph Ryan's family had spent 3 years trying to understand why a stranger had been chosen to die, and where a quiet neighborhood in Herndon, Virginia, still carried the memory of a February morning when the world stopped making sense. The story of Christine Banfield is, at its core, a story about betrayal, not just the dramatic, headline-making kind, but the quieter, more devastating kind that happens inside the walls of a home, between people who made promises to each other. Christine had no warning. She had not been given the chance to walk away, to protect herself, to even know that the life she believed she was living had been quietly hollowed out from the inside by the person she trusted most. She had spent her career protecting the most vulnerable, children in intensive care units, survivors of assault who needed a steady hand and a reliable witness. She had poured her strength into keeping others safe. She deserved, at the very least, to be kept safe herself. Joseph Ryan deserved that too. He was a stranger to this family, a man who had done nothing to invite violence into his life, who had received messages from an account he had no reason to distrust, and had shown up at an address in good faith. He was, in the fullest and most terrible sense, in the wrong place at the wrong time, because someone had engineered the place and the time and the circumstances specifically to destroy him. And Valeria, the 4-year-old who waited in the basement for a zoo trip that never came, who came upstairs into a world permanently altered, she was the case's smallest and most enduring victim. A girl who lost her mother and whose father was sentenced to die in prison. A child who had no part in any of it and no way to have foreseen or prevented it, and who will spend the rest of her life carrying the weight of what happened on her father's birthday in the upstairs bedroom of the only home she had ever known. The case of Christine Banfield did not end with a verdict. Verdicts are legal conclusions. The human reality of what was lost, Christine's hands, which had comforted sick children and held her daughter at night, Joseph Ryan's future, which had been erased by someone who didn't even know his name until he was chosen as a pawn. The ordinary life of a little girl who once waited at the bottom of the stairs to go see animals. That does not end when a judge reads a sentence aloud. It simply becomes part of what happened, part of the record, part of the world that Christine Banfield, in her 37 years of warmth and dedication and love, never deserved to leave behind. Story 2. The town of Lexington, South Carolina, carries the quiet charm of a place that has grown up alongside its community. It sits about 15 miles west of Columbia, the state capital, close enough to the city to feel connected, far enough to feel like its own world. Streets are lined with established neighborhoods. Families walk dogs in the evenings. Locals know each other by name. The Planet Fitness on Whiteford Way is one of those unremarkable, reliable anchors of daily life. A place people go to feel better about themselves, to push through a workout, to return home with their bodies tired and their minds a little clearer. On the evening of Thursday, June 11th, 2026, a woman named Elena Moore walked into that gym. She was 39 years old, 5 feet and 7 inches tall, with brown hair and brown eyes and a life built around health, fitness, and the people she loved. She was, by every account from those who knew her, a woman full of warmth, bubbly, always smiling, the kind of person who lit up whatever room she walked into. She was a personal trainer by profession, someone who had turned her own passion for wellness into a career, whose whole identity was tied up in the belief that the human body and spirit are worth taking care of. That evening, she had done what she did on so many evenings. She had gone to the gym. And then, somewhere between the gym and her home, Elena Moore vanished. People who knew Elena Moore described her in remarkably consistent terms. Her friend Mendy Miller, speaking to reporters in the days after Elena went missing, called her always smiling, and added something that resonated with everyone who had known her. To know her was to love her. Miller described how she had watched Elena grow from a young woman of 18 into the person she became, determined, passionate about fitness and health, carving out a meaningful place in her community. She really created a place for herself in this world, Miller said. Elena had been with her partner, Brandon Slice, for over 13 years. The two of them had only recently formalized their long relationship, tying the knot in 2024. It was by the quiet mathematics of a long commitment, the kind of union that seemed settled and rooted. They had built a life together in Lexington, in this town where neighbors said hello, and the evenings were warm in early June, and the air smelled of cut grass and coming summer. But in the weeks before she disappeared, the picture that emerged was more complicated than the one painted by outward appearances. Friends would later say that Elena had been behaving differently in the period leading up to June 11th. A video, allegedly recorded roughly a week before she vanished, appeared to show Elena attempting to enter a stranger's home, an act so out of character that it alarmed those who saw it. Her husband, Brandon Slice, had posted on social media before her disappearance that his wife was not well, a comment he later deleted. One close friend, Sandra Rochelle Campbell, told reporters that in the days before she disappeared, Elena had been acting paranoid. Campbell went further, alleging that there were serious problems inside Elena's marriage, and making the chilling claim that Elena had told her she was afraid for her life. These details would hover over the entire search, unresolved and troubling, as the community of Lexington tried to make sense of where Elena had gone. On that Thursday evening, surveillance cameras picked up Elena's movements in a way that gave investigators a partial but haunting record of her final known hours. At approximately 6:40 in the evening, she was seen at the Planet Fitness on Whiteford Way, arriving presumably for her regular workout. She was wearing an olive green zip-up hoodie and black athletic pants. It was a simple, ordinary outfit for a woman going to a gym. It would become the description broadcast across every news outlet in the state. Whatever happened inside the gym that evening, Elena left. Surveillance footage then caught her again, this time at the parking lot of a nearby Publix supermarket. The timestamp read 9:17 in the evening. She was walking alone, heading in the direction of Old Cherokee Road. Beyond that camera, beyond that captured moment, Elena Catherine Moore disappeared into the night. Her car was found the following morning, sitting in the parking lot of a Lowe's home improvement store near where she had last been seen. It was her husband, Brandon Slice, who found it. He was also the one who reported her missing to the Lexington Police Department that Friday, June 12th. The car being there, parked and unattended, her inside it nowhere, was the detail that turned a missing person report into something people in Lexington could not stop thinking about. Elena had not driven somewhere. She had not gone to visit a friend. She had walked away on foot, at night, toward a wooded area behind the Lowe's, in the direction of Old Cherokee Road, and then she was simply gone. Lexington Police Department Chief Terrence Green took the case seriously from the start. Investigators deployed drones and began combing through the wooded terrain behind the shopping area where Elena was last seen. The woods in that part of Lexington are dense and dark, tree cover that swallows light even in the daytime and becomes nearly impenetrable after nightfall. Searching them required not just manpower but patience, the willingness to move slowly and look carefully. On Friday, the initial aerial search found nothing. On the following days, the police continued to find nothing. On Monday, June 15, 2026, Chief Green announced that officers had performed a detailed search of the wooded areas along Kaufman Farm Lane, behind the Lowe's and Planet Fitness, covering the ground methodically. Once again, no trace of Elena was found. The days piled up. 1 became 2, 2 became 3, 3 became 5. The community of Lexington waited, growing more anxious with each announcement of another search yielding nothing. Friends posted on social media. A private investigation firm, Duke's Investigations and Consulting, announced a reward of $1,500 for any information leading to Elena's whereabouts. The town was looking. Through the early days of the search, Lexington Police spokeswoman Inspector Missy Silcox told reporters that there was no sign of foul play, and that Brannon Slice was not considered a person of interest at this time. These were careful, cautious words, the standard language of an early investigation that had not yet found anything to contradict the most benign explanations. Perhaps Elena was going through something. Perhaps she had walked away from a life that had become too heavy. People do sometimes. They leave without warning, without explanation, because something inside them has reached a breaking point that no one around them could see. But Elena's friends were not convinced by this theory. Sandra Campbell, speaking publicly, said she did not believe Elena had taken her own life. She spoke of a woman who was frightened, not despairing. A woman who feared something specific, something outside herself, not the darkness within. Those words, afraid for her life, refused to leave the public conversation about the case. On Wednesday, June 17, 2026, the sixth day of the search, everything changed. The Lexington Police Department received a tip from a member of the community. The information indicated that Elena Moore had been seen in a specific area on June 11th, between 4 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the afternoon, a stretch of time that preceded her gym appearance and gave investigators a new geographic anchor for her movements that evening. The tip pointed officers toward a wooded area near Old Cherokee Road and North Lake Drive, not far from Lakeside Middle School, a quiet, ordinary neighborhood landmark transformed overnight into a search site. At approximately 1:30 that afternoon, law enforcement personnel, a team of 5 officers, began searching the indicated area. The woods were close and still in the June heat, the kind of southern afternoon where the air sits heavy and even the sounds of the city beyond the tree line seem muffled and far away. They moved carefully, pushing through undergrowth, looking for any sign. At 2:48 in the afternoon, they found a body. It was a female. She was wearing an olive green zip-up hoodie and black athletic pants. Lexington Police Chief Terrence Green stood before cameras that evening and confirmed what the town had been dreading. "We found an unidentified body that fits the clothing description of our missing person," he said. He was careful. No formal identification had yet been made. The Lexington County Coroner, Margaret Fisher, issued a statement confirming that the body of a female matching the clothing description of Elena Moore had been found, but stressed that positive identification was yet to come. "We will await positive identification before any further information is released," Fisher said. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, known as SLED, the state's top investigative body, was immediately requested to take over the death investigation. It was a significant step. SLED is brought in for the most serious and complex cases in the state. Its involvement transformed what had been a missing person inquiry into something far more grave. Elena's friend Mendy Miller heard the news like so many others did, through a phone screen, in a moment that collapsed everything. "Complete devastation," she told reporters. "Even though it's not confirmed, we, the town of Lexington, the community, knew it was her." In the hours and days that followed the discovery of the body, the town of Lexington found itself suspended in a peculiar, painful limbo. The body had been found. The clothing matched. And yet, because official identification had not yet been made, every statement about Elena had to carry an asterisk, a qualification. She was believed to be the missing woman. The cause of death had not yet been determined. An autopsy was scheduled for the coming days. For Elena's friends and the community that had rallied behind the search, the waiting felt cruel. The certainty of grief had arrived before the paperwork of death. Mendy Miller spoke of the woman she had known for so many years, the young woman of 18 who had grown into a force of warmth and energy, the personal trainer who had built a community around wellness, who showed up in the world with a smile that her friends could not now imagine never seeing again. "She went from this young little girl at 18 to the woman she became today," Miller said. There was a broader, harder conversation unfolding alongside the grief. Elena's friend Sandra Campbell had gone on record to say that Elena was afraid of something, afraid of someone, in the days before she disappeared. Campbell leveled allegations about Elena's husband, suggesting that the marriage had been troubled, that Elena had confided fears she had not shared with the wider world. Investigators and private eyes working the case publicly stated they had found no red flags after speaking with Brandon Slice. Police maintained that Slice was not a person of interest, and yet the allegations hung in the air like the humidity of a South Carolina summer. Present, heavy, impossible to simply ignore. As of June 19, 2026, the Elena Moore case remains at its most critical juncture. SLED is conducting the death investigation. The coroner's autopsy is scheduled but not yet complete, meaning the official cause of death remains unknown to the public. A formal identification of the body found in the woods near Old Cherokee Road has not yet been released, though the entire community of Lexington has quietly accepted the almost certain reality of what that olive green hoodie means. What is known is this: Elena Moore was 39 years old, full of life and passion, a woman who had built something meaningful in the world. She walked out of a gym on a warm June evening in the town where she lived. Her car was found in a parking lot nearby. 6 days later, a body was discovered in the woods less than a mile from the last place she was seen on camera. What is not yet known is everything that happened in between. What unfolded in those woods on that June night. Whether Elena went there willingly or was taken. Whether someone is responsible for her death, or whether the answer lies somewhere more private and internal. The investigation is ongoing, and in ongoing investigations, facts arrive slowly and often incompletely, and the truth, the full, clear, unambiguous truth, takes time to surface. Elena Moore's story, as it stands today, is not a story with a resolution. It is a story with a question mark the size of a life. A woman walked into a gym one evening and did not come home. A community rallied and searched and hoped. A body was found in the woods. And now, while investigators piece together what happened, a town waits. Her friend Mendy Miller said something that captures the weight of the moment with a simplicity that no formal statement could match. To know her was to love her. It is a sentence that doubles as an epitaph, not just for a person, but for a life that those who were close to her insist was not finished, was not in any way ready to be over. The question of what happened to Elena Moore on the night of June 11, 2026, remains unanswered. SLED investigators are working the case. A cause of death will be determined. Formal identification will be made. Whether charges will be filed, against whom, for what, is a question that belongs to the coming days and weeks, when the forensic evidence has been fully processed and the investigators have had the time to follow wherever the facts lead. In the meantime, the woods off Old Cherokee Road are quiet again. The gym on Whiteford Way is open, as it always is. The parking lot at Lowe's holds ordinary cars on ordinary errands. And somewhere in the machinery of justice, the truth about Elena Moore is slowly being assembled. Piece by piece, fact by fact, waiting to be told in full. Story 3. Snellville, Georgia is the small town that does not expect to make national news. Nestled in Gwinnett County in the northeastern suburbs of Atlanta, it is a community built on the bedrock of ordinary American life. Churches on corners, strip malls along the main road, families in modest houses with backyard barbecue grills and minivans in the driveway. People here work, raise children, attend school events, and build the kind of small, decent lives that rarely attract attention from the wider world. April 26, 2009 was a Sunday, and like most Sundays in Snellville, it began as just another unremarkable day. Blue sky, warm air, the particular quiet of a weekend afternoon when the week's obligations have not yet resumed. It ended with a young woman dead in a parking lot, an 18-month-old boy crying alone in the back seat of her car, and a mystery so bizarre that the police officers who arrived at the scene would struggle for months to believe that what the evidence was pointing toward could possibly be true. Heather Struby was 25 years old. By the spring of 2009, her life had taken the kind of difficult turn that young lives sometimes take when early choices and bad luck arrive in the same season. She had married Stephen Struby, a young man from the Luthersville area southwest of Atlanta, and together they had a son, a little boy named Carson, 18 months old, with his whole life ahead of him. The marriage had not held together. By April 2009, Heather and Stephen had separated, and what had once been a family unit had become a battleground, fought not with raised voices in living rooms, but with lawyers and court dates, and the particular coldness of a custody dispute. The kind of legal conflict that reduces the love between parents and children to schedules, pick-up times, and the formal language of family court filings. Heather was fighting for her son. Those who knew her described her as devoted to Carson, a young mother who had made her child the center of everything she was working toward, who wanted stability in custody and the ordinary daily life of putting her boy to bed at night and being there when he woke in the morning. She had problems, struggles that the custody battle had surfaced and scrutinized, but her love for her child was never among the things in dispute. She was, by every account that mattered, a mother who wanted nothing more than to raise her son. On the other side of the custody battle was not just Stephen Struby, it was his family. And at the center of Stephen's family, with a particular intensity that went well beyond the ordinary concern of a grandmother for a grandchild, was his mother, Joanna Hayes. She was in her mid-40s, a woman from Luthersville who had strong opinions about her son's marriage and stronger ones about his divorce, and who had made no secret of the fact that she believed Heather Struby was not a suitable mother for her grandson. The custody dispute had become, in Joanna Hayes's world, not merely a legal matter but a personal crusade, a fight she had defined in terms of her own family's honor and her grandson's future, a fight in which she had apparently decided that the courts were moving too slowly and the outcome was not guaranteed enough. No one outside of Joanna Hayes's own mind knew, in those weeks before April 26th, exactly what she had been planning. But the plan itself, when it finally emerged from the parking lot of a suburban Georgia Target, was one of the most surreal and audacious acts of premeditated violence that the investigators of Gwinnett County had ever encountered. The arrangement for that Sunday was routine and practical. Heather and Stephen had agreed to meet at the Target store on Scenic Highway North in Snellville for a custody exchange, a common enough arrangement for separated couples managing shared parenting from different addresses. Stephen would bring Carson. Heather would take him. The Target parking lot served as neutral ground, a public space that made the handover easier and less fraught than meeting at either person's home. It was the kind of arrangement that thousands of co-parenting couples across America use every day, a piece of logistics dressed up as a truce. At approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, as the Sunday afternoon shifted toward early dusk and the parking lot filled and emptied with weekend shoppers, Stephen Struby pulled up and handed Carson over to Heather. He then drove away. Heather walked to her car, a red vehicle parked in the lot, opened the rear door, and began the familiar, ordinary, deeply maternal act of strapping her 18-month-old son into his car seat. It was the most innocent possible moment, a mother securing her child, the evening sun still in the sky, a shopping center buzzing with the noise and traffic of an ordinary Sunday. Then a figure approached. Witnesses in the parking lot that evening would later describe what they saw to police, and their descriptions would sound, at first, almost too strange to believe. The approaching figure was wearing a dark wig styled in a thick, bushy cut, something that reminded one witness of the hair famously worn by the 1960s musician Sonny Bono. The figure wore a fake mustache. The walk was peculiar, slightly stiff, slightly theatrical, the gait of someone performing an unfamiliar role in a costume that did not quite fit. Witnesses initially assumed the figure was a man. That had been the intention. The disguise was not sophisticated in the way of Hollywood special effects. But it did not need to be. It only needed to work for the 2 or 3 minutes it took to cross a parking lot on a Sunday evening, approach a young woman, and do what came next. The disguised figure walked directly to Heather's car. They spoke. There was a brief, heated exchange. Witnesses said, a confrontation of some kind in the middle of the parking lot. Heather, still standing by the open rear door of her car, was in the act of dealing with her son when this figure arrived. She had no warning. She had no reason to expect that this particular exchange would be anything other than the same difficult custody handover she had been navigating for months. She could not have known, in those seconds, what was coming. A passing motorist caught Heather's eye in those final moments. She mouthed a single word, help, with the quiet, desperate urgency of someone who had already understood that something was terribly wrong. The word never reached anyone in time. The disguised figure raised a .38 caliber handgun, pressed it to Heather Struby's forehead at point-blank range, and pulled the trigger. The shot was immediate and fatal. Heather collapsed in the parking lot beside her car. The figure turned and walked away, not running, not panicking, but walking with the same deliberate pace that had carried them across the parking lot in the first place. Unhurried, controlled, as if what had just happened was simply the completion of a task. In the back seat of the car, 18-month-old Carson Struby was still in his car seat. He was unharmed. He was alone. He was crying. The first officer who arrived at the scene found a young woman dead in the asphalt and a baby in the back seat, and the full weight of what he was looking at. The innocence of the child, the brutality of what had been done to his mother right beside him, was something that veteran officers who worked the case would describe years later as one of the hardest things they had ever seen in the field. The investigation began immediately. Gwinnett County and Snellville police canvassed the parking lot for witnesses. The Target store had surveillance cameras, and investigators pulled the footage quickly. It captured the figure in the wig and mustache crossing the lot, the brief confrontation, the shooting, and the figure's retreat. What the footage also suggested, to trained eyes reviewing it carefully, was that the shooter might not have been a man at all. The build, the gait, the frame beneath the costume. The surveillance footage raised the possibility that a woman had done this dressed as a man, in one of the most brazen and deliberately theatrical disguises in Georgia criminal history. The first circle of investigation widened in the directions that homicide cases always initially travel, toward the people closest to the victim, toward motive, toward the personal geography of Heather Struby's life. Stephen Struby, her estranged husband, was interviewed. He cooperated with police. Investigators evaluated his alibi. He had, by all accounts, driven away from the parking lot before the shooting occurred. But as detectives looked deeper into the world of the custody dispute, as they mapped the bitterness and the stakes and the people for whom the outcome of that legal battle felt personally catastrophic, a name kept rising to the surface. Joanna Hayes, Stephen's mother, Heather's mother-in-law. The details assembled themselves slowly, but with gathering momentum. Hayes drove a white pickup truck, and witnesses in the parking lot had noticed a white pickup idling in the Target lot near the time of the shooting. An idling vehicle that could have been the getaway, the staging, the retreat. Investigators began examining Hayes's truck. The evidence they sent to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation for forensic analysis had been collected, at least in part, from that vehicle. They also knew, from the nature of the crime and the surreal elaborateness of the disguise, that they were looking for someone with a specific and personal motive. Not a robber, not a stranger, not someone with a transactional reason to harm Heather Struby, but someone for whom her death solved a very particular problem. The months that followed were a test of patience for everyone, for Heather's parents Mary and Henry Allen, who had been awarded temporary custody of Carson in the days after the killing, for the investigators who knew what the evidence was pointing toward but needed it to be ironclad before they moved, and for a community that was watching the case with the particular unease that comes from knowing the killer had not yet been identified or caught. Captain Harold Thomas of the Snellville Police Department told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, more than 3 months after the shooting, that police were very close to making an arrest, and that they believed they knew who had committed the crime. They were simply waiting for the GBI's analysis of the physical evidence to come back and confirm what they already suspected. The confirmation came. In December 2009, 8 months after Heather Struby died in a parking lot beside her baby, police arrested Joanna Hayes at her home in Luthersville and charged her with murder. She was 45 years old. She had, according to prosecutors, dressed herself in a wig and a fake mustache, driven her white pickup truck to the Target on Scenic Highway North in Snellville, waited for the custody exchange to be completed, walked across the parking lot in her disguise, argued briefly with her daughter-in-law, pressed a .38 caliber handgun to that young woman's forehead, and pulled the trigger. She had done all of this, prosecutors alleged, because she did not want Heather Struby to have custody of her grandson Carson. She had looked at the family court proceedings and, for whatever calculus governed her thinking, had decided that the legal system was not going to give her the answer she wanted quickly enough, or at all, and that the solution was to remove Heather Struby from the equation entirely. The son, Stephen, was also investigated. Prosecutors looked carefully at whether he had played any role in facilitating or enabling what his mother had done. Investigators also reviewed his conduct in the aftermath of the shooting. Ultimately, he was not charged in connection with the killing, but his role in the wider picture, as the son of the woman who had done this, as the father of the child in the back seat, as the man in the middle of the custody battle that had produced the motive, made him a figure of profound and complicated significance in a story that had no uncomplicated figures at all. The trial of Joanna Hayes opened at Gwinnett County in May 2011, 2 years after the murder, and the courtroom became the stage for everything that the investigation had assembled. The prosecution presented its case through the surveillance footage, the witness testimony, the forensic evidence gathered from Hayes' truck and from her person, and the detailed account of the custody battle that had provided the motive. 2 key male witnesses who knew Hayes testified for the prosecution, providing accounts that helped prosecutors establish the connection between Hayes, the disguise, and the killing. Stephen Struby himself faced the almost impossible position of sitting in that courtroom as the son of the defendant and the father of the child who had been left in a car beside his murdered mother, and, according to reporting at the time, confronting his mother directly, asking her the question that the entire case had been moving toward: why? The murder weapon was never found. The prosecution acknowledged this and built its case around the convergence of everything else: the surveillance footage, the motive, the matching truck, the forensic evidence, the testimony. The defense argued insufficiency of evidence, the same ground it would later contest before the Georgia Supreme Court. But a Gwinnett County jury was not persuaded by the defense. On May 11, 2011, after deliberating on the evidence presented to them, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Joanna Hayes was convicted of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. The judge sentenced her to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years, meaning that if she served her minimum term, she would not be eligible for parole consideration until she was in her mid-70s. She appealed the conviction to the Georgia Supreme Court, challenging the sufficiency of the evidence. The Supreme Court, in 2013, reviewed the record and found the evidence sufficient to support the jury's verdict and affirmed the convictions and sentence. Heather Struby's parents, Mary and Henry Allen, had been awarded custody of Carson in the days after the killing, and became the people who raised him in the absence of his mother. Heather never got to finish the custody battle she had been fighting. She never got the ordinary daily life she had been working toward, the mornings and bedtimes and school runs and years of watching her son grow, that she had gone to a Target parking lot to secure for herself. She died beside her car with the word "help" still on her lips, having seen the danger a half-second too late, having been shot before anyone in that parking lot could reach her. The case became a reference point for the particular horror of domestic violence that moves laterally through families, the violence that is not intimate partner violence in the conventional sense, but that flows from the same possessiveness, the same belief that other people are objects to be controlled rather than individuals with their own sovereignty. Joanna Hayes had not pulled a trigger because of a sudden eruption of feeling. She had done it deliberately and in costume, after months in which she had watched a custody battle and decided that the courts were insufficient to her purposes. She had used the structure of co-parenting, the scheduled exchange, the neutral public location, the predictable routine, as the mechanism of ambush. She had made her son the instrument of timing, and her grandson the unwitting witness. And she had left a child crying alone in a car seat beside his dead mother, as the result of something she had chosen to do with full premeditation. Heather Struby was 25 years old. She mouthed the word "help" to a passing stranger in the final seconds of her life. It is a detail that stays with people who read this case, that last moment of reaching toward the world, of asking for something that arrived just too late. She was putting her son into his car seat. She was doing the most ordinary, loving, maternal thing. And the woman who killed her had watched her do it, had walked across an open parking lot in broad daylight in a wig and a mustache, and had decided, in the full clarity of premeditation, that this mother's life was worth less than a custody arrangement. Story 4. Long Island wears two faces. The one most people recognize from a distance is the face of ambition realized. The sprawling suburbs pressed against the coastline east of New York City, the well-kept lawns, the modest two-story houses packed tight on quiet streets. The commuter culture of people who have found a way to work in one of the greatest cities on earth, while living in the kind of neighborhoods where children can ride bikes to the corner store and older couples walk their dogs at dusk. It is a place that has, for generations, represented a certain American promise, that if you work hard enough, you can afford a small piece of the ordinary world, and that ordinary world will be safe. The other face of Long Island is the one that was hidden for nearly 3 decades in the salt marshes and the scrub and the thick brush along Ocean Parkway, a long, flat coastal road that runs between the Atlantic Ocean and the bay, past Gilgo Beach, through a landscape that is beautiful in a windswept and desolate way, and that is, by night, as isolated as any stretch of wilderness. This is where, beginning in 1993, a man deposited the bodies of women he had killed. One by one, year after year, for 17 years, while living out his days less than 20 minutes away in the very same Long Island suburb where he had been born. That man was Rex Andrew Heuermann. This is the story of how one of America's longest and most haunting cold cases was finally cracked open. Rex Heuermann was born on September 13, 1963, in Massapequa Park, a village on Long Island's South Shore, not far from the beaches that would one day bear his victims. His father, Theodore, was a World War II veteran, a former Air Force officer, an aerospace engineer, a disciplined, accomplished man who died when Rex was barely 12 years old, leaving the boy in the care of a mother whom childhood acquaintances later described as controlling and domineering. Heuermann was the middle child, sandwiched between 3 older sisters and a younger brother. Former classmates from Berner High School in Massapequa remembered him as quiet, shy, socially awkward, and frequently bullied. A boy who was smart, but somehow unable to translate that intelligence into the casual social currency that makes adolescence survivable. He graduated in 1981. A member of his senior class was the actor William Baldwin. The 2 young men who shared the same hallways and the same graduation ceremony would travel in directions that could not have been more different. Heuermann went on to study architecture at the New York Institute of Technology, and by 1987, he was working for an architectural firm in Manhattan. By 1994, he had started his own firm, RH Consultants and Associates, a professional consultancy that would eventually count some of the most prominent buildings in New York City among its projects, including the Oculus Transportation Hub at the World Trade Center site. He had purchased his childhood home in Massapequa Park from his mother in 1994, and he continued to live there, in the house he had grown up in, for the rest of his adult life. He married his second wife, Asa Ellerup, in April 1996, and they raised 2 children together in that same house. The dilapidated, cluttered house on the quiet street that neighbors increasingly noticed was falling into disrepair while the properties around it were kept neat. From the outside, Rex Heuermann was a commuter, a father, a businessman, a man with a briefcase on the Long Island Railroad. He was large, physically imposing, tall and broad, and he walked through the city every day like thousands of other professionals, invisible in his ordinariness. And somewhere underneath all of it, or running alongside it like a current beneath still water, was something that none of the people who shared the train with him or sat in the same business meetings could see. The first confirmed killing came in 1993. Sandra Costilla was 28 years old, a woman originally from Trinidad and Tobago, who was living in New York City and working as a sex worker when she disappeared on November 19th of that year. Hunters found her body the following day in a wooded area in North Sea, on the eastern end of Long Island, 60 miles from where the later victims would be found near Gilgo Beach. Evidence, investigators would eventually conclude, that Hoyerman's method of disposal had changed over time, that he had moved closer to home as he grew more confident and more deliberate. Sandra Costia lay in that wooded area for 31 years, unidentified, unnamed in connection with this case. Her death a cold and unsolved file that no one had yet connected to anything larger. 3 years later, in early 1996, Karen Vergata disappeared. She was 34 years old, from Manhattan, working as a sex worker, last seen around Valentine's Day, February 14, 1996. She was never reported missing. On April 20th of that year, her severed legs were found in a garbage bag on Fire Island, the barrier island east of Gilgo Beach. No one knew who she was. She became a name in a database of unidentified remains, a puzzle with pieces scattered across the coastline, waiting for a science that did not yet fully exist to put them back together. Her skull and several teeth were not found until 2011, more than 15 years later, recovered at Tobay Beach in Nassau County. Her identity was not confirmed until 2023, 27 years after her death, through the emerging technology of genetic genealogy. The technique of using family DNA from ancestry databases to work backward toward an identification. Valerie Mack was 24 years old and had grown up in foster care. She had a young son. She was working as an escort under the alias Melissa Taylor when she disappeared sometime in 2000, last seen by family members in the spring or summer of that year in the Port Republic, New Jersey area. She was never reported missing. On November 19, 2000, her torso was found wrapped in garbage bags in Manorville, New York, left among the trees near a set of power lines, dumped with a calculated coldness that showed its perpetrator had been doing this for years. The rest of her remained missing for more than a decade. In 2011, her head, right foot, and hands were recovered at Gilgo Beach. Nobody connected the two sets of remains for another 9 years. Valerie Mack was not officially identified until May 2020, 2 decades after her death. Jessica Taylor was 20 years old, living in Manhattan, working as a sex worker near the Port Authority bus terminal when she vanished on July 21, 2003. 5 days later, her torso was found in Manorville, in the same area where Valerie Mack's remains had been discovered 3 years before, disposed of with a similar deliberateness that investigators would later recognize as the signature of the same pair of hands. A tattoo on her body had been mutilated with a sharp instrument, as if someone had tried to slow her identification. Her skull, hands, and forearm were found separately in 2011, miles away on the Ocean Parkway corridor. The scattered geography of her remains told a story of a man who was comfortable with the landscape, who knew where things could be left and how long it would take for them to be found. And then, in the years between 2007 and 2010, the killings accelerated. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was 25, a mother of 2 from Norwich, Connecticut, who had been working as a seasonal telemarketer and turned to sex work after she could not find other employment and received an eviction notice. She had been out of the industry for 7 months when financial desperation brought her back. On July 9, 2007, she told a friend she planned to spend the day in New York City and was never seen again. A week after she vanished, her friend Sarah received a call from a man with an untraceable number who claimed to have seen Maureen alive and well at a house in Queens, but refused to give a location and never called back. It was, investigators would later understand, the killer himself, toying with the people who were looking for her, confident in his invisibility. Melissa Barthélemy was 24 and had been living in the Bronx, working as a sex worker through Craigslist under the alias Chloe. She disappeared on July 12, 2009, the same date, years later, that Rex Hoyerman would be arrested. On the night she vanished, she deposited $900 in her bank account and tried to call an ex-boyfriend. Then she was gone. What happened next is one of the most chilling details in this entire case. Beginning 1 week after Melissa's disappearance and continuing for 5 weeks, her 15-year-old sister Amanda began receiving calls from a man using Melissa's phone. He was cruel and deliberate in those calls, insulting, mocking, taunting a teenage girl about her missing sister, telling her that Melissa was dead, that he was going to watch her rot. Police traced some of the calls to Madison Square Garden in Midtown Manhattan, and some to Massapequa, the very suburb where Hoyerman lived. They could not identify the caller. He was calling from the phone of a woman he had already killed, taunting her family, and leaving no trace of himself that the technology of that moment could capture. Megan Waterman was 22, from Scarborough, Maine, a mother of a 3-year-old daughter whom she had left with family while she worked in New York. She went missing on June 6, 2010, from a motel in Hauppauge, 15 miles from Gilgo Beach. She had posted escort advertisements on Craigslist. She was reported missing 2 days later when she failed to check in on her daughter. That telephone silence, the breaking of a mother's routine contact with her child, was what finally raised the alarm. Amber Lynn Costello was 27, originally from North Carolina, living in West Babylon in a house she shared with other people struggling with addiction. She had been a strong student in her youth, but heroin had narrowed her world until it held very little except the next need. On September 2, 2010, she left to meet a client who had called her repeatedly and offered $2,500 for her company, an unusually large sum, the kind of offer that a person in her circumstances could not easily turn down. Her roommate saw her leave and noted the vehicle waiting for her, a dark Chevrolet Avalanche, first generation, driven by a large man. Amber Lynn Costello walked toward that truck and was never seen alive again. The thread that would unravel everything had been left at the scene, woven invisibly into the evidence, waiting. In December 2010, a Long Island woman named Shannon Gilbert disappeared after fleeing in terror from a client's home in a gated community in Oak Beach, calling 911 in a state of panic, banging on strangers' doors and screaming for her life before running alone into the night. She was 24. Her cause of death remains officially disputed. Suffolk County ruled it accidental drowning, but her disappearance set in motion the search that would break the entire case open. Police searching for Shannon along Ocean Parkway in December 2010 began finding remains in the dense brush that lined the road. First Melissa Barthelemy, then Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes, all within a short stretch of the parkway, all discovered within days of each other. For women, their bodies left like discarded things in the salt brush of Long Island. For sets of remains that transformed a missing persons case into something the world sat up to notice. By the spring of 2011, 6 more sets of remains had been found along the extended search corridor, including portions of Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, and the unidentified body that would be known for years as Asian Doe. The case was now enormous. It was national news. Profilers constructed a picture of the killer, likely a white male, familiar with the South Shore of Long Island, with knowledge of remote disposal sites, organized and controlled in his behavior, someone who had been doing this for years and had never left enough to catch him. The investigation dragged through years. The FBI formally joined in 2015, after internal politics and interagency friction that had hampered cooperation for years were finally cleared. In January 2020, Suffolk County Police released an image of a leather belt found near one of the burial sites, stamped with the letters HM or WH, hoping the public could identify it. In 2021, the emerging science of genetic genealogy, the same technique that had solved the Golden State Killer case in California, began to be applied to this one. Samples of hair found with the victims were compared against DNA databases. A hair found near one of the victims matched, through genealogy, to a female family member of an as-yet unknown suspect. The investigation narrowed its field of view. Then, in March 2022, investigators made the connection that would eventually lead them to a name. A dark green first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche, The vehicle that Amber Costello's roommate had described watching her get into on the night she vanished was traced through vehicle registration data to Rex Heuermann. The address was in Massapequa Park. Phone records were subpoenaed, and what they showed was staggering in its implications. Heuermann's personal cell phone records showed contact with 3 of the 4 Gilgo 4 victims, while a series of burner phones, untraceable prepaid devices, had been used to contact all 4 of them. The signal data for those burner phones placed them at or near Heuermann's home address and his office in Manhattan when they were being used. An email account linked to Heuermann had been used to search for information about the investigation into the very murders he had committed. He had been monitoring the case from the inside, tracking what investigators knew, watching to see how close they were getting. The DNA, when it came, was both confirmatory and deeply revealing. Investigators conducted covert surveillance of Heuermann and recovered discarded items from outside his home, including a pizza crust. The DNA from that pizza crust matched DNA found on the burlap used to wrap one of the victims. A second match emerged from the hair samples recovered from near or on the bodies of 3 victims. Those hairs matched DNA from samples recovered from hair care products retrieved from the trash outside Heuermann's home, and matched the DNA profile of his wife, Asa Ellerup. The wife, investigators noted with careful precision, had not been at home during any of the periods when the killings were believed to have occurred. Her DNA was on the victims' bodies not because she was involved, but because she was his wife, because her hair had been carried on his clothing, transferred in the ordinary intimacy of a shared domestic life onto the bodies of the women he had killed. Investigators also discovered that Heuermann had searched online for what was described in court records images of the victims and their families, the latter suggesting he had been observing, from a distance, the pain he had inflicted on the families of the women he had killed. On July 13, 2023, a Saturday night, the same date of the week on which Melissa Barthelemy had disappeared 14 years before, Rex Heuermann was arrested as he walked away from his office in Midtown Manhattan. He was 62 years old, carrying a briefcase, wearing a suit. Police took him into custody without incident. He was charged the following day with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of second-degree murder for the killings of Barthelemy, Waterman, and Costello. His wife filed for divorce. His children were left to make sense of the demolition of everything they thought they knew about their father and their family. The charges expanded over the following 18 months. In January 2024, he was charged with the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes. In June 2024, with the murders of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Costilla, extending the known timeline of his killings back to 1993, 30 years before his arrest. In December 2024, with the murder of Valerie Mack. The evidence had kept accumulating, charge by charge, year by year, as DNA analysis and genealogical detective work slowly unlocked the identities of women who had been left in the landscape of Long Island without names for decades. Heuermann had pleaded not guilty to all of it. A September 2025 ruling by Judge Timothy Motze consolidated the 7 murder charges into a single trial, scheduled for early 2026. And then on April 8, 2026, the day the trial was set to begin, Rex Heuermann stood before the court and changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to all 7 murders. And then he went further. He admitted on the record to an 8th killing, that of Karen Vergata, the woman whose legs had been found in a garbage bag on Fire Island in 1996, and who had gone unidentified for 27 years. He was not charged with Karen Vergata's murder. He admitted it anyway, as if having decided, finally, that there was no longer any purpose in holding back the full account. On June 17, 2026, Heuermann stood before the court at sentencing, and the families of the women he had killed stood to face him. They had come from Connecticut and Maine and Manhattan and North Carolina and New Jersey, carrying the long weight of waiting, some of them for decades, and they said what needed saying directly into the face of the man who had taken people they loved. The judge, after hearing all of it, sentenced Heuermann to 3 consecutive life terms for first-degree murder plus 25 years to life on each of 4 additional second-degree murder counts, all running consecutively, a mathematical impossibility of imprisonment that served one single and unmistakable purpose: ensuring that Rex Andrew Hoyerman would die in a cell. The judge reportedly told him to get out of the courtroom. He was escorted away. The 8 women he killed were Sandra Costilla, Karen Vergata, Valerie Mack, Jessica Taylor, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. They ranged in age from 20 to 34. They were mothers and daughters and sisters and friends. They came from Trinidad and Tobago, from Maine, from Connecticut, from North Carolina, from cities and towns across the eastern United States. They had found themselves in vulnerable positions, working in an industry that made them easy to dismiss and hard to search for, and a man who understood that vulnerability had used it as a weapon against them for 17 years. Some of them had been missing for decades before their names were placed next to his. Some of them had been found in pieces. Some of them had waited 30 years for a courtroom in which the word guilty was finally spoken. The case of Rex Hoyerman is not only a story about a killer. It is a story about who we choose to look for and who we don't, and what the consequences of that choice look like 3 decades later when the science finally catches up to the silence. It is a story about the women who were dismissed as difficult to search for because of how they earned their living, and about the investigators who kept the cases open anyway, through the years of political friction and interagency failure and cold silence, until the technology and the determination arrived in the same moment. It is a story about a man who sat on the Long Island Railroad every morning in a suit with a briefcase, a man who had an office in Manhattan and a family at home and a lawn that was slowly going to ruin, and who was for 17 years one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, hiding in the most ordinary place imaginable, in plain sight, on the same island where he had been born, and where he had buried the evidence of what he was. Story 5. London in the summer of 1992 had the particular, unhurried warmth of an English July doing its best. Pale blue skies that never quite burned with the full confidence of a Mediterranean afternoon. A softness in the light that made the parks and commons of the city glow in a way that only those who have lived through a long British winter fully appreciate. People came out to breathe, to walk, to let children run on grass, to be among the trees and the open sky. Wimbledon Common, stretching across 900 acres of southwest London, was one of the city's great open lungs, a place of ancient woodland and meadow and winding paths where deer sometimes moved at the edges of the treeline, and where Londoners had been walking their dogs and pushing their prams for generations, in the easy, trusting way of people who have never been given a reason to feel unsafe. On the morning of July 15, 1992, Rachel Nichols set out onto Wimbledon Common with her golden retriever, Molly, and her 2-year-old son, Alex. She was 23 years old, a young woman from a loving middle-class family who had grown up in the kind of ordinary, affectionate home that gives a person a strong foundation and a natural trust in the world. She had worked as a part-time model, and she was beautiful in the effortless way of someone who does not think much about it. But the Rachel Nichols who walked out onto the common that morning was defined not by her appearance, but by her life with Alex and her partner Andre Hanscom, a man she had been with since she was a teenager, who was at work that Tuesday morning while Rachel took their boy for a walk in the summer sun. Alex was small enough to be lifted easily, curious about everything, at the age where children learn the world through touching it and naming it and asking endless questions. He wore his little shoes on a path that was familiar to them both. Rachel had walked Molly on the common many times. It was part of their routine. The morning was warm, the paths were quiet at that early hour, and nothing about setting out from their flat that Tuesday suggested that Rachel Nichols would not be coming home. At approximately 10:20 in the morning, a passerby on Wimbledon Common heard a child crying. The path through the trees led to a small clearing, and what the passing walker found there was something that would be impossible to forget for as long as they lived. Rachel Nichols was on the ground. 2-year-old Alex was crouched over her, his small hands on her body, repeating the same words over and over in the way of a child who does not yet have any framework for what is in front of him. "Wake up, Mummy," he said. "Wake up, Mummy." He had been trying to rouse her. He did not understand why she would not. Rachel Nichol had been physically assaulted and stabbed 49 times. One of the wounds had nearly severed her head from her body. The attack had continued even after she was dead, a forensic pathologist would later determine. The violence had been extreme, excessive, sustained, the work of someone in the grip of something that had moved far beyond any ordinary human rage into a territory that most people cannot conceive of. Her dog Molly had been tied to a nearby tree, out of reach of her mistress. The news of Rachel Nichol's murder struck London like a blow to the chest. She was young, she was a mother, she had been walking her dog on a sunny Tuesday morning in a well-known park in broad daylight. The children playing within earshot. The morning commuters still on the tube. The image of a 2-year-old boy crouching over his mother's body saying, "Wake up," was one of those details that bypassed analysis and went directly to the deepest part of the human heart, where every parent in the country felt it as their own terror, and every non-parent felt it as something equally irreducible and devastating. The Metropolitan Police launched an investigation of enormous scale. Detectives took more than 1,000 statements. Pathologists analyzed every wound. Officers canvassed the common and the surrounding neighborhoods. But for all the machinery of investigation set in motion, the case produced no witness to the killing itself. Whatever had happened in that clearing, it had happened quickly and without anyone seeing it. Wimbledon Common, for all its openness, had lanes and copses and shaded paths where a moment of terrible violence could occur in complete privacy, and the person who had done this had vanished back into the city as if he had never existed. 2 months after Rachel's death, attention settled on a man named Colin Stagg. Stagg was 29 years old, unemployed, and lived in a flat in Roehampton, a short distance from Wimbledon Common. He was a regular walker on the Common, and had been seen there by multiple people. He was single, something of a loner, and, crucially for the direction the investigation was about to take, he had written letters in response to a Lonely Hearts newspaper advertisement in which he had expressed certain fantasies. In September 1992, he was arrested on suspicion of murder and questioned. There was no forensic evidence linking him to the crime. There was no witness evidence placing him at the scene. There was, investigators conceded, nothing concrete. But the pressure to solve a murder that had paralyzed the city was immense, and the police had convinced themselves that Colin Stagg was their man. What followed was one of the most ethically compromised investigations in the history of the Metropolitan Police, and one of its greatest institutional failures. Senior officers brought in a criminal psychologist named Paul Britton, who had constructed a profile of the likely killer. That profile, officers believed, fitted Stagg, and so they devised an operation, given the internal name Operation Edsel, in which an undercover female police officer, using the alias Lizzie James, would contact Stagg, develop a relationship with him over months of correspondence and meetings, and coax him toward an admission of guilt by presenting herself as a woman who was attracted to and aroused by exactly the kind of violent fantasy the killer was believed to harbor. The operation lasted months. Lizzie James wrote to Stagg. She visited him in the park. She constructed an elaborate false persona. She told Stagg that she had been involved in occult rituals, that she was sexually excited by violence, that she wanted a partner who shared those inclinations. Stagg, a lonely man who had rarely had meaningful relationships with women, and who was clearly developing real feelings for this person he believed he had met, went along with some of the sexual correspondence, describing fantasies that he later said he had largely invented to impress her and keep her interest. When the conversations reached the critical moment, when Lizzie indicated that she could only truly be with Stagg if he had killed Rachel Nichol, Stagg's response was not a confession. It was a denial. "I'm terribly sorry," he said, "but I haven't." It was not what the police had hoped for. But the operation pressed on regardless. And in August 1993, despite the absence of any forensic evidence, without any eyewitness, with a profile from a criminal psychologist standing in the place of actual proof, Colin Stagg was charged with the murder of Rachel Nichol. Andre Hanscom, Rachel's partner, was still waiting for justice with the raw, excruciating patience of someone who has no choice. He had come home from work on July 15, 1992, to find the world he had known that morning completely gone, his partner dead, his 2-year-old son in the care of strangers after being discovered alone on a common with his mother's body. He had given interviews, pressed for answers, tried to raise Alex in the absence of the woman who had been the center of both their lives. And now there was a man charged. Now finally, it seemed, the process of accountability was beginning. It was not. The case against Colin Stagg never reached a verdict. In September 1994, when the case came before the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, the judge, Mr. Justice Ognall, reviewed the prosecution's evidence and its methodology and refused to allow the honey trap material to be placed before a jury. His condemnation of the police operation was unambiguous and devastating. He described the conduct as deceptive conduct of the grossest kind, and noted that the operation had been designed not to find the truth, but to manufacture a case against a man the police had already decided was guilty. Without the honey trap evidence, there was nothing. The case collapsed. Colin Stagg walked out of the Old Bailey a free man, his name legally cleared, but his life already irrevocably altered by the accusation. He would later receive £706,000 in compensation from the Home Office for the wrongful arrest and prosecution, in recognition of what had been done to him. He had spent 13 months on remand in prison for a murder he had not committed. And Rachel Nichol's actual killer, still free, still walking through the streets of southeast London, went on with his life for another 14 years before he was finally brought to account. Robert Clive Napper had been born on February 25, 1966, in Erith, in the southeast of London. His childhood was one of those histories that, in retrospect, functions as both explanation and indictment, not an excuse for what he became, but a map of the road that led there. His father was violent toward his mother, and Napper witnessed that violence repeatedly before his parents divorced when he was 9. He and his siblings were placed in foster care and underwent psychiatric treatment for 6 years at the Maudsley Hospital in Camberwell. He was socially shunned at school, described by peers as despised, the kind of boy who could not find a way to connect with the ordinary social world of childhood. At 13, a family friend sexually assaulted him on a camping holiday. The offender was jailed. Napper changed, became more withdrawn, more obsessive, more menacing to those around him. He began spying on his sister, bullying his siblings, polishing his private miseries until they were too heavy to carry without looking for somewhere to put them. By 1989, he had committed his first crime. He was 23. The victim was a woman attacked on Plumstead Common in southeast London, not far from where Napper lived. Something remarkable and terrible happened in the aftermath. Napper's own mother called the police. She told them that her son had confessed to her that he had committed a rape in the area. The police received that call. They investigated, and they could find no case that matched the details as she described them, partly because she had given them the wrong location. The rape that Napper had actually committed had taken place in a house backing onto Plumstead Common, not on the common itself. The police took no further action. Pauline Napper, unable to trust what she knew about her son and unable to reach anyone who would act on it, broke off contact with him entirely. What she had tried to prevent continued. Through 1992, Napper conducted at least 2 attempted rapes and at least 1 completed rape of women in the southeast London area. Each attack was violent. Each was in an outdoor or semi-public location. And on July 15, 1992, he walked onto Wimbledon Common. Why that morning? Why that woman? There is no testimony from Napper that fully explains the specific choice and his mental illness. He would later be diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and Asperger's syndrome, meant that the logical framework governing his actions was not the framework of ordinary human motivation. What is known is that he was in the area, that Rachel was alone on a path with only a toddler and a dog, and that the violence that followed was of a type consistent with his known behavior: frenzied, sexually motivated, directed at a woman he had no prior connection to, in an outdoor setting where he believed he could escape unseen. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall and powerfully built. Rachel Nichol had no chance once he was upon her. In August 1992, a photo fit based on the descriptions of a suspect in a series of rapes in southeast London, attacks that investigators would later confirm were part of Napper's pattern, was released by police. A man who knew Napper recognized the photo fit and told police. Officers went to Napper's house and arranged for him to come in and give a DNA sample. He did not show up. A second identification was made by a work colleague. Officers visited again. He failed to attend the appointment again. And then, in October 1992, detectives investigating the rapes reviewed Napper's name. They decided to eliminate him from inquiries. Their reason was a rule of thumb the investigation had imposed. The rape suspect had been described by some victims as approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, and detectives had decided to exclude anyone over 6 feet. Robert Napper stood 6 feet 2 and walked with a stoop that could make him appear shorter. That measurement, that administrative decision, removed him from the inquiry at the very moment when he should have been pulled in. 3 days later, Napper was arrested on an unrelated firearms charge and briefly jailed. In November 1993, 16 months after Rachel Nichol's murder, Napper broke into the ground floor flat of a 27-year-old woman named Samantha Bissett in Plumstead. She was a single mother. Her 4-year-old daughter Jasmine was asleep in the flat. Napper killed Samantha Bissett with stab wounds to the neck and chest, physically assaulted and smothered her daughter Jasmine, and then mutilated Samantha's body in the sitting room, taking parts of it away as a grotesque trophy. The scene was so extreme that the police photographer assigned to document it was forced to take 2 years' leave of absence after witnessing it. A fingerprint recovered from the Bissett flat led, in May 1994, to Robert Napper's arrest. He was charged with the murders of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett. When Detective Sergeant Alan Jacquemont arrested Napper, he immediately recognized the significance of what he had found: that this man, now in custody, bore all the hallmarks of the kind of person who could have killed Rachel Nichol 2 years earlier. He flagged the connection to the Nichol investigation team. In December 1994, Napper was questioned about Rachel's murder. He denied ever visiting Wimbledon Common. He was not charged. He was convicted of the Bissett killings in October 1995 and sent to Broadmoor Hospital for the criminally insane, where he would remain, and where, for the next 13 years, the question of what he had done on Wimbledon Common on July 15, 1992, remained officially unanswered. In October 2001, the Metropolitan Police launched a formal cold case review of the Rachel Nichol murder. They submitted the original evidence to the Forensic Science Service using techniques that had not existed in 1992. Initial findings were inconclusive. A second laboratory, the Forensic Alliance, later known as LGC Forensics, was brought in to review the exhibits again in January 2002. In July 2004, LGC Forensics reported the result that changed everything. DNA analysis of samples recovered from Rachel Nichol's body had produced a mixed profile. That profile identified Robert Napper as a possible suspect. Further tests were conducted to eliminate any doubt. In July to September 2004, the match was confirmed beyond scientific question. Police now had what they had not had in 1992, a name attached to irrefutable biological evidence, attached to a man already imprisoned in a high-security psychiatric hospital. They spent the next 3 years building the case to an unshakable standard of certainty, knowing that Napper would challenge every element and that the prosecution had to be flawless. In November 2007, Robert Napper was formally charged with the murder of Rachel Nichol. He was 41 years old. He had been in Broadmoor since 1995. He initially pleaded not guilty. On December 18, 2008, 16 years and 5 months after Rachel Nichol was killed on Wimbledon Common, Robert Napper stood in the dock at the Old Bailey and entered a guilty plea. not to murder, but to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, a legal classification that acknowledged the role of his severe and medically documented mental illness in the commission of the act. The distinction between murder and manslaughter in this context was not a diminishment of what he had done. It was a recognition, by the court and by the psychiatric evidence presented to it, that Napper was not a man who had made an ordinary criminal choice. He was a man whose mind had been broken in ways that made him extraordinarily dangerous, in ways that no hospital had treated and no agency had stopped, despite the multiple opportunities that had existed to do so. Mr. Justice Griffiths Williams sentenced Napper to indefinite detention at Broadmoor and addressed him directly from the bench. "You are in any view a very dangerous man." Andre Hanscom, Rachel's partner and the father of Alex, had spent 16 years carrying the grief of that Tuesday morning and the added burden of watching an innocent man prosecuted while the real killer remained at large. By 2008, Alex was 18 years old. A young man who had spent his entire conscious life without his mother, who had no memory of her that was not colored by the knowledge of how she had died, and who had been the closest witness to her final moments without the capacity to understand or retain what he had seen. The Rachel Nichol case is, ultimately, several stories layered on top of each other, and each layer carries its own weight of meaning. It is the story of a young woman who took a morning walk with her dog and her son, and was murdered in one of the most brutal acts of violence that South London has ever produced. It is the story of a 2-year-old boy who sat with his mother's body and asked her to wake up, and who grew into a man who had to build a life around that foundational wound. It is the story of a police investigation that chose the wrong man, pursued him with manufactured evidence, and in doing so lost 13 years in which the real killer remained free to kill again. It is the story of Colin Stagg, the innocent man who was publicly accused, imprisoned, and never fully released from the suspicion even after the court cleared him, whose life was remade by something that was entirely not his doing. And it is the story of Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter Jasmine, killed in their flat in 1993 because Robert Napper was never stopped, murdered, in a real and terrible sense, by the same failures that had allowed him to walk away from Wimbledon Common. Justice arrived. It always arrives too late, and this one arrived 16 years too late. But the name Robert Napper is now attached, in the public record and in the archive of the Old Bailey, to what he did on a summer morning to a young woman and the small boy who loved her. Rachel Nichol was 23 years old. She had a dog named Molly, and a son named Alex, and a partner named Andre, and a whole life she was living on a Tuesday in July, in a city that should have been safe. Story 6. The seaside town of Blackpool sits on the northwestern coast of England, its famous tower rising against grey skies, its promenade lined with the cheerful noise of amusement arcades and fish and chip shops. It is a town of bright lights and loud laughter, a place families come to for holidays and memories. But behind one door on Staining Road, behind curtains drawn against the summer light, a 13-month-old boy named Preston Davyy endured the last and most terrifying months of his brief life. A life that had barely begun before the people entrusted to protect him chose instead to destroy it. This is the story of how a system built to save a child failed him, how a man the world believed was a pillar of respectability turned out to be something far more sinister, and how a jury, after 8 grueling weeks of evidence, delivered a verdict that sent shockwaves across Britain. Preston Davyy came into the world on June 16, 2022, at Wythenshawe Hospital in South Manchester, arriving 4 weeks early and weighing just 5 pounds and 7 ounces, small, fragile, a fighter from the very first breath. His birth mother, Sarah Davyy, was unable to care for him. Within 5 days of his birth, Oldham Council stepped in, placing the newborn into emergency foster care through an interim care order. From the very start, Preston's life was one of borrowed safety. He was loved by foster parents who were not his own, held in a home that was never meant to be permanent. For 9 months, Preston lived with those foster parents. The social workers and agencies involved in his care documented him as a child who needed above all else, love, affection, safety, and stability. For things that any child deserves, for things that the system promised it would find for him. He was a baby who had already been through more disruption in his first year than most people experience in decades. The hope was that the right adoptive family would give him the foundation he had never had. In December 2021, months before Preston was even born, two men in Blackpool had already begun the long and rigorous process of becoming adoptive parents. Jamie Varley was 35 years old at the time, a secondary school teacher who held the position of head of year at South Shore Academy, a high school operating under the Sidari Multi-Academy Trust in Blackpool. He was, by all professional appearances, a man who cared about young people, someone who had devoted his career to their education and well-being. His partner, John McGowan-Fazakerly, was 30 years old, a sales manager and, by background, an ex-public school boy. Together, they presented a portrait of stability and aspiration. The adoption agency they worked with, Adoption Now, handles placements on behalf of local councils across the northwest of England. The process took over a year. Assessments were conducted, home studies were completed, background checks were run. On January 6, 2023, Varley and McGowan-Fazakerly were formally approved as prospective adopters. The agency noted that Preston needed love, affection, safety, and stability, and concluded that these two men could provide exactly that. On February 13, 2023, Varley and McGowan-Fazakerly made their first visit to Preston at his foster home. Whatever they saw in that small, bright-eyed child, whatever feelings that meeting stirred, the process continued. A family court gave its permission. On April 1, 2023, 9-month-old Preston Davyy was placed into the care of Jamie Varley and John McGowan-Fazakerly at their home on Staining Road, Blackpool. He spent his first night in what was supposed to be his forever home. He had just under 4 months left to live. Adoption is never easy. Even children placed in the most loving homes can struggle with disruption, with the loss of familiar faces and sounds and routines. Jamie Varley, who had taken a year off from his teaching job specifically to be present for the transition, described the early weeks as an eye-opener. That Preston struggled with sleep and had not yet settled into a routine. But what was happening inside that house was something far beyond the ordinary challenges of new parenthood. Just 5 days after Preston arrived, on April 6, 2023, Varley sent a text message to his sister, a baby sleep trainer, about the child's sleeplessness. The message read, "He's dead meat today. Didn't sleep last night after 11:30. Up every 1.5 hours. His sister, presumably accustomed to hearing tired new parents vent their frustrations, may not have read it as anything more than dark humor. In the context of everything that followed, those words would take on a chilling significance. The weeks passed. Preston began to show signs that went far beyond normal baby difficulties. Bruises appeared on his body, on his forehead, marks that forensic experts would later say were consistent with someone gripping his head, bruises on his thigh consistent with being slapped with an open hand. These were not the scrapes of a crawling, tumbling baby learning to explore the world. These were injuries with specific patterns, specific shapes, patterns that told a story of deliberate harm. On May 25, 2023, less than 2 months after Preston moved in, Varley rushed the baby to Blackpool Victoria Hospital. Preston arrived floppy and unresponsive, and Varley reported that the child had suffered a seizure and was having breathing difficulties. Nursing staff examining the baby noticed bruising to his head. Varley, standing in the emergency department, said something that would later be presented as a telling moment. "You lot are going to think we have been abusing him or something." It was the kind of remark that can be interpreted 2 ways. To a tired, frightened new parent with an injured baby, it might be a nervous, self-conscious comment, the fear of being misjudged. But to those who later pieced together what was happening on Staining Road, it read differently. It read like a man who was already rehearsing his defense. Preston was taken to Blackpool Victoria Hospital not once, but 3 times in the space of less than 4 months. On June 30, 2023, Varley and McGowan physically brought him in, reporting that he had a rash, diarrhea, vomiting, and a high temperature. Then, on July 6th, Varley brought him in again with an injury to his left arm. Each visit was another moment when the system had a chance to look more closely at the small boy in its midst. Each visit was a moment when Preston could have been taken to safety. He was routinely mistreated, abused, and physically assaulted, sustaining 40 traumatic injuries to his body, both external and internal. The injuries told the story of a child subjected to harm not in a single moment of rage, but over weeks and months, by someone who had calculated the risks and believed he could manage them. Varley, the experienced educator, the head of year who had spent his career managing young people in an institutional setting, appeared to treat even his own crime as something to be organized and controlled. McGowan physically's role was somewhat differently. He had misplaced his trust in his partner, that he had never directly witnessed Varley harm the child, and that he had been deceived. July 23, 2023 was a Sunday. On that afternoon, Varley took a series of photographs of Preston over a period of 3 minutes and 12 seconds. What those images contained was the abuse Preston was suffering in the final days of his life. 4 days later, on July 27, 2023, at 4:45 in the afternoon, Varley recorded a 35-second video on his phone. In it, Preston could be seen in what medical experts would describe as extreme respiratory distress, taking what is known as an agonal gasp, the labored, involuntary breathing of a body in the process of shutting down. The child was in desperate need of resuscitation, yet Varley filmed it. At 7:15 that evening, police were called to Blackpool Victoria Hospital. Varley and McGowan physically had brought Preston in. He was unresponsive. Despite the efforts of the medical staff, 13-month-old Preston Davyy was pronounced dead that night. Varley's account to the authorities was that Preston had accidentally drowned in the bathtub. He said he had left the baby alone in the bath for a few minutes and returned to find him submerged. It was a story that seemed, on the surface, to offer a tragic but innocent explanation. Accidents happen. Babies are left alone for a moment. A distraction, a phone call, a few seconds too long, and disaster follows. But the evidence did not match the story. When the medical team examined Preston, his hair was dry. He was still wearing his nappy. There was no sign that he had ingested water. The post-mortem examination, conducted by a home office pathologist on July 31, 2023, found that Preston's cause of death was acute upper airway obstruction and ruled out drowning entirely. 40 injuries were documented on his body. The drowning story was not just implausible. It was, the forensic evidence suggested, a fabrication. The wheels of justice turned slowly, as they often do in cases of such complexity. Jamie Varley was arrested and suspended from his teaching position in 2023. Both he and McGowan physically were charged in October 2025, more than 2 years after Preston's death. Varley faced 33 counts in total, including murder. The trial began in April 2026 at Preston Crown Court. For 8 weeks, the jury sat and listened. They heard from medical experts who described the nature and extent of Preston's injuries. They were shown the photographs and videos Varley had taken on his own phone, evidence that he had created himself, evidence that would ultimately convict him. They heard from the prosecution, led by barrister Nicholas Wright, who told the jury that the evidence clearly showed Preston had been murdered by one of those entrusted with his care, and that Jamie Varley was the man responsible. Varley took the witness stand and maintained his innocence. He told the court he was ashamed of the photographs he had taken of Preston. He denied murdering him. He projected, according to reporters covering the trial, an air of careful composure, what one journalist described as a performance. He was, after all, an educator, a man trained to stand before an audience and command a room. But the forensic reality of Preston's injuries and the digital trail Varley himself had created told a different story. On June 15, 2026, nearly 3 years after Preston's death, the jury returned their verdict. Jamie Varley was found guilty of murder. He was also convicted of 2 counts of assault, 5 counts of cruelty to a child, grievous bodily harm, 13 counts of taking indecent photographs or videos of a child, 1 count of distributing an indecent photograph to his co-accused, and 1 count of making an indecent image. John McGowan Fazakerly was found guilty of causing or allowing the death of a child, 2 counts of child cruelty, and 1 count of sexual assault. The sentencing took place on June 18, 2026. The courtroom at Preston Crown Court had heard evidence of unspeakable harm over the course of 2 months. Now it fell to Mr. Justice Turner to impose punishment. For Jamie Varley, the judge handed down a whole life order, the most severe sentence available under English law, reserved for only the most extreme cases. A whole life order means exactly what it says. Varley will remain in prison for the rest of his life, with no possibility of parole except under the rarest compassionate circumstances. He was 37 years old when sentenced. The man who had once stood in front of classrooms, shaping young minds, who had passed every adoption assessment, who had charmed a system into handing him a defenseless baby, will die inside a prison cell. John McGowan Fazakerly was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Outside the court, there were people who remembered Preston, the social workers, the foster parents, the professionals who had, in good faith, believed they were placing him somewhere safe. There was Preston's birth grandmother, who, as the Telegraph reported, had wanted to care for him herself, but was unable to do so because she had been diagnosed with breast cancer. She had wanted to keep him. She had been unable to, and so Preston had gone to strangers. The case of Jamie Varley raises questions that will take years to fully reckon with. How did a man with these tendencies pass the rigorous vetting process required for adoption? How did 3 hospital visits not trigger a more urgent protective response? What more could the system have done for a baby who had already been in care since he was 5 days old? Oldham Council and adoption now have faced scrutiny in the aftermath of the case. The adoption approval process, the hospital responses, and the safeguarding mechanisms that were in place, or not in place, have all come under the microscope. A child who was placed into care specifically because he needed protection ended up in the hands of the very kind of person that protection was supposed to guard him against. Preston Davyy lived for 13 months. For the first 9 of those months, he was safe, held in foster care, looked after by people who fed him and held him and kept him from harm. Then he was moved, and in the 4 months that followed, he experienced suffering that no child should ever know. He died on a summer evening in a hospital in Blackpool, unaware of the trial that would follow, the verdict that would come, the sentence that would be passed. He knew none of it. He knew only what a baby knows: warmth or cold, comfort or pain, the presence of someone who cares or the terrible absence of it. The Varley case has become part of a painful national conversation in the United Kingdom about adoption safeguarding, about how predators can hide behind professional reputations, and about the gaps in systems designed to protect the most vulnerable. Preston's story does not have a redemptive ending. There is no rescue, no last-minute intervention, no moment where the truth arrives in time. The truth arrived 3 years too late to save him. A jury of ordinary people who sat for 8 weeks, looked at the evidence and said, clearly, firmly, and without equivocation, that what was done to Preston Davyy was murder, and that the man who did it will never walk free again. It is not justice in the sense of making things right. Nothing can make this right. It is justice in the only sense that remains when a child is gone. The acknowledgement, formal and permanent, that his life mattered, that what was done to him was wrong, and that the person who did it will answer for it for as long as he lives. Preston Davyy was born 4 weeks early, small and fragile, weighing 5 pounds and 7 ounces. He deserved a lifetime. He was given 13 months. And in the end, the only thing the law could do, the only thing any of us can do, is remember his name and make sure the world knows what happened to him and why it must never happen again. Story 7. The scorching heat of August 17, 2014, bore down on Tehachapi, California, a small mountain pass community where freight trains rumbled through daily, carrying goods across the state through one of the busiest rail corridors in America. At the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railway facility, 38-year-old Robert Leone reported for his shift, a call-in assignment that had him working on what should have been his day off. Robert, known as Rob to his friends and family, was a dedicated employee who had built a solid career with the railway company, providing for his wife Sabrina and their 2 young children in their home in the Hesperia area. He was well liked by colleagues, described as a good man who loved his family and took pride in his work. But as Rob settled into his duties that Sunday morning, he had no idea that someone was planning to ensure he would never leave that building alive. Rob and Sabrina Leone had been married for years, and to outsiders, they appeared to be a solid couple navigating the challenges of raising children and maintaining careers. But their relationship was unconventional in ways that few people knew. The Lemones had what they called an open marriage, an arrangement where both partners engaged in encounters with other couples as part of the swinging lifestyle. It was an agreement that worked for them, or so it seemed, until Sabrina met someone who would transform a physical arrangement into an emotional entanglement that would have deadly consequences. Late in 2013, Sabrina was working part-time at Costco, handing out food samples to shoppers and engaging in the kind of cheerful small talk that the job required. One day, a customer approached her table, and what began as a casual conversation about samples evolved into something more. His name was Jonathan Hearn, and he was 24 years old, significantly younger than Sabrina, who was in her early 30s. He was a firefighter with the Redlands Fire Department, a job that carried prestige and suggested heroism, someone who literally saved lives for a living. He was intelligent, articulate, and deeply religious, someone who spoke passionately about his Christian faith and seemed to embody moral values. Over several visits to Costco, Jonathan struck up conversations with Sabrina, and eventually he asked for her phone number. Sabrina later testified that she didn't immediately tell him she was married, enjoying the attention and the flattery that comes from an attractive younger man expressing interest. When he did learn about her marriage, Jonathan was conflicted, knowing that pursuing a relationship with a married woman violated the Christian principles he professed to hold dear. "I enjoyed spending time with her," he would later testify, "but then there was also the guilt of recognizing that I was doing something immoral." Despite that guilt, or perhaps fueled by the forbidden nature of the relationship, Jonathan and Sabrina began an affair that quickly became all-consuming. Sabrina would later describe him as like nobody I'd ever met before, someone who made her feel special and seen in ways her husband didn't. She called the affair almost like a second life, a secret existence separate from her role as wife and mother. They met in parking lots and hotels, exchanging thousands of text messages and spending hours on phone calls, building an intimate connection that went far beyond the casual encounters Sabrina had experienced in her open marriage. But the affair couldn't remain hidden forever. In April 2013, Rob discovered intimate text messages between Sabrina and Jonathan on her phone, and he was devastated. The open marriage arrangement was one thing, but a full-blown emotional affair was something else entirely, a betrayal that cut to the heart of their relationship. Rob confronted Jonathan directly, demanding that he end the relationship with Sabrina. Jonathan agreed, and Sabrina promised Rob that she would cut off all contact with her lover. For a time, it seemed the couple might repair their marriage and move forward. But Sabrina and Jonathan couldn't stay away from each other. They resumed the affair secretly, more careful now about covering their tracks, knowing that if Rob found out again, the consequences would be severe. And as the relationship continued and deepened, a terrible idea began to take shape in conversations between the lovers. What if they didn't have to hide anymore? What if Rob wasn't in the picture? Jonathan would later testify that Sabrina told him divorce wasn't an option, that in their community and social circle, ending a marriage would be viewed negatively, that Rob would be devastated, that he would honestly rather be dead than divorced. He claimed that Sabrina painted a picture of Rob as controlling and objectifying, behaviors that made Jonathan's hatred for the other man grow. "Her demons became my demons," Jonathan testified, describing how his love for Sabrina transformed into a willingness to commit an unspeakable act. By early 2014, Sabrina and Jonathan had moved beyond fantasizing about being together to actively planning how to make it happen. Their first scheme was methodical and chilling in its calculation. Jonathan ordered arsenic trioxide online, a deadly poison that could be mixed into food. He prepared a batch of banana pudding, Rob's favorite dessert, and stirred the poison into the mixture. Then he gave the tainted pudding to Sabrina, who was supposed to give it to Rob to take to work. But at the last moment, fear of getting caught overwhelmed them. Sabrina called Rob at work and told him to throw out the pudding, claiming the bananas had gone bad. It was a narrow escape from what would have been a particularly cruel death, and it bought Rob a few more months of life, though he had no idea how close he had come to being poisoned by his own wife. Unable to follow through with the poisoning plot, Jonathan and Sabrina eventually settled on a more direct approach. They decided that Jonathan would confront Rob in person and shoot him. To prepare for the murder, Sabrina provided Jonathan with detailed information about Rob's workplace, including a layout of the BNSF facility in Tehachapi and Rob's work schedule. They acquired burner phones, prepaid, disposable devices, to communicate about the murder plot, hoping to avoid leaving an electronic trail that law enforcement could trace. On March 23, 2014, Jonathan drove to Tehachapi to scout the location, using the information Sabrina had provided to familiarize himself with the railway facility and plan his escape route. But months passed, and he couldn't bring himself to follow through. Then, on August 16, 2014, Rob received a call asking him to work the following day. Sabrina immediately contacted Jonathan, informing him of Rob's schedule, and they agreed. This would be the day. On the morning of August 17th, Jonathan woke up in his home in Redlands and called Sabrina. They stayed on the phone as he prepared himself mentally for what he was about to do, talking for approximately 80 minutes as he gathered his equipment. His motorcycle, a mask to conceal his identity, and his firearm, a large caliber handgun. He got on his motorcycle and began the ride to Tehachapi, still talking to Sabrina as he traveled, drawing strength from her voice as he moved closer to committing murder. When he arrived at the BNSF facility, Jonathan stopped just outside the office doors where Rob was working. In a moment that would later be revealed in his testimony, he prayed, asking God for strength to do what he was about to do. The terrible irony of seeking divine assistance to commit murder apparently lost on him in that moment. Then he put on his mask, entered the building, and confronted Rob Leone. Rob was shot twice. The first bullet struck him, and he fell mortally wounded. Jonathan attempted to stage the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong, moving items and creating the appearance of a burglary. Then, to ensure Rob was dead, Jonathan fired one final shot into Rob's face at point-blank range. Surveillance cameras on the property captured footage of an unidentified person on a motorcycle near the facility around the time of the murder, though the quality wasn't sufficient for a positive identification. Jonathan got back on his motorcycle and rode home, calling Sabrina to tell her the news. "I had done it," he testified. Everything was about to change. But for Rob Leone's two children, everything had already changed in the worst possible way. Their father was dead, shot down in his workplace by someone he had never suspected posed a threat. The investigation into Rob's murder initially followed predictable lines. Detectives looked at workplace conflicts, robbery motives, and personal enemies, but nothing immediately made sense. BNSF Railway posted a $100,000 reward for information leading to an arrest, recognizing that one of their employees had been murdered at their facility and wanting answers. Friends rallied around Sabrina, offering support to the grieving widow and her children. And Jonathan Hearn, the firefighter with a spotless reputation, began showing up at the Leone house with increasing frequency, bringing Sabrina flowers, cooking dinner for the family, offering comfort in what everyone assumed was a generous gesture of support. Then, 2 weeks after Rob's murder, a firefighter named Jason Bernatine made a phone call that would crack the case wide open. Jason had trained with Jonathan when the younger man was starting his career, and they had remained friendly, occasionally socializing in group settings that included the Lemones. 1 year earlier, in 2013, Jonathan had confessed to Jason that he was having an affair with Sabrina Leone, even admitting that he had told Rob about it. Jason had confronted Jonathan about the inappropriateness of the relationship, urging him to end it, and Jonathan had agreed. But recently, Jason had received strange text messages and a voicemail from Jonathan that made him uneasy. When Rob was murdered, Jason's mind immediately went to Jonathan, to the affair, to the question of who would benefit from Rob's death. I started thinking, who would want Rob dead? Who wanted Rob out of the picture? And the only person that walked into my mind was Jonathan Hearn, Jason said. He called Detective Darren Grantham of the Kern County Sheriff's Office and shared what he knew. The tip transformed the investigation. Detectives learned about the affair and discovered that Jonathan owned a large caliber firearm similar to the one used to kill Rob. They found that he drove a Yamaha motorcycle that matched descriptions of the bike seen on surveillance footage near the crime scene. But they needed more evidence, something concrete that would prove Jonathan and Sabrina had conspired to commit murder. In November 2014, approximately 3 months after Rob's death, authorities obtained authorization to wiretap Sabrina and Jonathan's phones. For 10 days, investigators listened to hours of conversations between the two, recordings that would prove devastating when played in court. The lovers talked constantly, professing their affection for each other even as they worried about the investigation closing in on them. "I love you so much, my girl," Jonathan told Sabrina in one call. In text messages sent in the weeks after the murder, Sabrina wrote, "Oh, how I love you. I adore you, Jonathan. I want to kiss you right now and not stop. And I miss you so much, baby." On November 7, 2014, Sabrina learned through contacts at BNSF that authorities might have them under surveillance. In wiretapped conversations after that revelation, detectives could hear the panic in both voices as they realized the net was tightening. Both Jonathan Hearn and Sabrina Leone were arrested shortly thereafter and charged with murder. Prosecutors felt confident about the case against Jonathan, but the evidence against Sabrina was more circumstantial, resting heavily on the wiretap conversations and Jonathan's eventual testimony. Initially, Sabrina was released due to insufficient evidence, and she moved with her 2 children over 100 miles away, seemingly poised to escape prosecution. Then, in late 2016, with his own trial looming just weeks away, Jonathan Hearn made a decision that would seal Sabrina's fate. He struck a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for pleading guilty to voluntary manslaughter instead of first-degree murder, he would testify against Sabrina and provide authorities with evidence he had hidden. Under the agreement, Jonathan would face 25 years instead of life without parole. Sabrina was rearrested in early 2017, and her trial was scheduled. In September and October 2017, Sabrina Leone stood trial for the murder of her husband. Jonathan Hearn spent multiple days on the witness stand, describing in detail how they had plotted Rob's death, from the failed arsenic poisoning to the final shooting at the railway facility. He testified about how Sabrina had provided him with Rob's work schedule, how she had given him information about the facility layout, how they had used burner phones to coordinate their plans. The jury heard the wiretapped phone calls and read the intimate text messages. They saw surveillance footage of the motorcycle and listened to testimony about Jonathan's weapons and his connection to the crime scene. The prosecution painted a picture of a calculated conspiracy between lovers who wanted to be together and saw murder as preferable to divorce. Sabrina took the stand in her own defense, a risky move that her attorney believed was necessary. She admitted to the affair, but denied any involvement in planning her husband's murder. She claimed she loved Rob and never wanted him dead, that she had the best of both worlds, with a husband and an attentive lover, and saw no reason to change that arrangement. She explained that she had given Jonathan Rob's work schedule only because she wanted the 2 men to meet and hopefully come to some understanding. As for the burner phones, she claimed Jonathan had insisted on them, telling her about the dangers of what could happen when an affair is exposed, how the police think and how they work. Her attorney, Richard Terry, argued that Jonathan Hearn had acted alone, that his plea deal gave him every incentive to lie and implicate Sabrina to reduce his own sentence. But the jury didn't buy it. After 3 weeks of testimony, they convicted Sabrina Leone of first-degree felony murder, conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation to commit murder, and being an accessory to a crime. They acquitted her of the charges related to the attempted arsenic poisoning, apparently finding Jonathan's testimony on that point less credible. The jury found that Sabrina had provided Jonathan with crucial information about how to get to Rob's workplace and when he would be there, and that she had used the burner phone to avoid detection. On November 15, 2017, Jonathan Hearn appeared in court for his sentencing hearing. He stood before the judge and delivered an emotional statement, breathing deeply and sniffing back tears as he spoke eloquently about his crimes. "I have evoked God's name and have acted exactly opposite to his dictates," he said, acknowledging the profound hypocrisy of his actions. He apologized to Rob Leone's family, including his 2 children, saying he was responsible for destroying their childhood. He apologized to his own family for acting against the Christian teachings they had instilled in him, to his fellow firefighters, to law enforcement, to court staff, even to journalists for exposing them to my evil. Judge Michael J. Raphael sentenced Jonathan Hearn to 25 years and 4 months in prison, a sentence significantly less than the life term he would have faced without the plea agreement. Afterward, members of both the Leone and Hearn families, who had each attended the proceedings in numbers, hugged and cried together in the courthouse hallway, united in grief over the tragedy that had destroyed so many lives. Sabrina Leone was sentenced in February 2018 to 25 years to life in prison. She has maintained her innocence and filed appeals arguing that Jonathan Hearn lied on the stand to benefit from his plea deal. Her appellate attorney continues to fight to overturn the conviction, but as of now, Sabrina remains incarcerated, separated from her children who were forced to grow up without either parent. The case of Jonathan Hearn and Sabrina Leone stands as a devastating reminder of how passion can transform into obsession, how love can curdle into conspiracy, and how 2 people who professed moral values and Christian faith could justify murder to satisfy their desires. A firefighter who had co-written a book about courage in the line of duty proved himself capable of cowardice and evil. A wife and mother who claimed to love her husband ultimately provided the information that led to his execution. And Rob Leone, a good man who worked hard to provide for his family, was shot down in his workplace by someone who had never even met him, murdered simply because he stood in the way of 2 people who wanted to be together.